It's great to be here. This feels a bit like a second home, and in fact may become more so. And it was funny when Craig asked me to come. Owen laughed because Craig was trying to build up about coming, and I just said yes, I'll come. And the reason is my son now lives in Melbourne, and so I've got even more reason to come over here. And Owen laughed and he said, "Oh, you needn't have given her any incentives. She should have come anyway because she'd have come to see her son." I'm delighted to be here, and I think probably some of that comes from the relationship that we've had with Australian colleagues over 25 years, and the influence and the leapfrogging that we've had over the years from one country to the other, back and forth. And in the audience here, there are some people that I would call, they're not colleagues, they're chums, and we've worked together to support developments in both countries and also internationally. So I'm delighted to be here. So I'm going to talk about developments in the UK over the last 20 odd years. And I'm going to start by looking at, this was Sue Estroff in Canada, social worker, who also had the experience of having psychotic difficulties. And she described services, and this is back in the early 90s, which is, I got help early when I needed it, and so did my family. We were able to see doctors and others who were well trained and knowledgeable about when, where, and how to make referrals. We saw people who respected us and taught us. I never had to go before a judge or a magistrate to get help for me. I got to go to school, live in a decent place, get money, have my pets, have a life without giving up everything else, like my dignity, my hopes for the future I'd want to be in. No one hassled me about how sick I was, whether I deserved to get help. I just got it. And when I talked, people listened. Sounds great, doesn't it? But in fact, slides aren't moving on. Oh, here. Too good to be true? It was. And people talked about the tragedy of schizophrenia, but actually it was the tragedy of the treatment in terms of what people were offered. Because all of those aspirations that maybe now we might see as part of the experience for young people, and it was lovely hearing Robin talk, how different it was 25 years ago, because none of those things were possible. And so that was the experience at the time, and I'm a clinical psychologist by background, and I was working in rehabilitation. And what I found was that I was being asked to influence things, maybe in terms of people's self-esteem, their confidence, maybe tackle persisting symptoms that had actually had their onset many, many years before. And that began a process for me clinically of wanting to get nearer and nearer to where these problems started, because I felt I had probably the likelihood of greatest impact if I got in there either before these things changed or early when things were changing. I wasn't the only one who was working in that way, and there are some familiar faces to some of you here. The top face there is Max Birchwood, and I was Max's first trainee clinical psychologist. He'd been qualified a couple of years and he was able to take on a trainee, and I was Max's trainee, and he'd done a PhD looking at the needs of families, and he was the minute at that time writing it up, and he influenced me in my thinking as he talked about how families like Robin, their sort of experiences there, and very little had been done with families at that point. And in fact, he was so influential that I went on to do my PhD looking at interventions for families. So I built on Max's PhD to look at how do we respond to families. And Max convinced me to stay on and work with him. And we applied for a grant and in fact established the first family service in the UK for people with, at that time we were using the term schizophrenia, but sort of included a broad range of schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, psychosis. And in fact, probably at that time, because we didn't have the concept, when we were working, I would say about half of the families we were working with were first episode families. And that certainly influenced our thinking. At the same time, in 1995, on the bottom left there is David Shires, who Pat talked about. And David Shires was a GP in North Staffordshire, in the sort of north of England. And he probably, knowing David over the years, I'd say was a very value-based worker. He would want to do right by people coming into his surgery. And it was lovely to hear your experience, Robin, of primary care. And I imagine David would have been sensitive and supportive to families and trying to do the best by them. But actually, he saw mental health services from a very different angle when his daughter Mary, there in the picture, developed a psychosis age 15. And suddenly he saw the kind of experience that you described, you know, a child and adolescent service that didn't really do psychosis, an adult service that didn't really do young people, and then a rehabilitation service that didn't actually rehabilitate but housed. And David became angry. And it's interesting about that line, Pat, because I know that you and I have been angry at various points over the year. And sometimes that's a hard line to tread, particularly when you're working in orthodox services, because there are many ways in which you can be silenced or shut down. Certainly David experienced that, where he was told he should be a responsible practitioner and should, you know, stop biting at the service that in which he worked. But actually he wasn't happy. He was an angry parent, and we were able to channel that anger. And luckily that was thanks to the person in the middle, Anthony Sheehan, who was the mental health lead at the time in the region. So David's complaints about the care reached the ears of Anthony Sheehan, very bright, lovely, warm regional manager. And he thought, who do I know who I can bring together to listen to these concerns of David and to think about what we might do in response to it. So Anthony brought in Max, myself, and the lady below, which is Fiona McMillan, and all three of us had worked together in Birmingham. Fiona had moved to North Staff, so knew David, and 5 of us met in a room. And we were all from different health service providers, so we weren't all working together then. And we met with David as a GP, Anthony as a regional lead, and we decided to call ourselves something. We called ourselves IRIS, the Initiative to Reduce the Impact of Schizophrenia. And Anthony set us a challenge, and at that time we thought that was going to influence care in the West Midlands. We never conceived it would have the reach that it did, and in fact at various points I said, this feels like emperor's coat clothes, who's going to listen to this? And one thing I learnt from those early conversations was never underestimate the power of informal conversations and where those conversations might lead. Because in fact, the person we were influencing was in the room with us, and that was Anthony Sheehan, who actually made a meteoric rise to government, and so took the thinking from those discussions to government and was then in a position to influence what happened within the UK. Now, interestingly, we were a group of 5, and that led us into work in social movement, and this is a quote from social movement. You know, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Now, it wasn't just us. This is a massive, massive movement that grew and attracted other people, and there are people here from the UK within that room that were part of that. IRIS was a useful thing to have because it gave us another place to sit, because I was a health worker challenging health services, but actually I could sit as chair of IRIS and make comments, and so I had a place out of the orthodoxy to sit. And that has always been helpful to us, and alongside a national programme, we've always kept IRIS going. And part of that allows us to sit outside of the orthodoxy and challenge it while still working within it. And that has been a useful place, but we've also allied with others. And the message we had then was we set out a series of guidelines based on best practice about what we think should happen for early psychosis. And that was articulated in that green folder. I've still got one left on my shelf. And that articulated a set of a framework and tools for what the experience should be like for people like Mary and other people and families. And in fact, someone asked me, would you change that? And I said, the only thing I would change is as new evidence and research has emerged, I would add to it. But actually, those core principles are still there. But what I would add in are some of the things around physical health, because we hadn't reached that. We hadn't thought about that. I know Phil's sitting there is going to talk about that. We also really didn't have the developments around peer support and carer support workers that we now have, and I would certainly put that in. And at the time, we didn't really have the sort of strength of evidence around IPS and education and employment support, although we said that was really, really important. So some things I'd emphasise more strongly. So what we articulated was a model of care. But it was more than just a model. It wasn't saying that it should have these elements. It was about a philosophy of care. And some of the things that Pat talked about, the idea that we should be offering treatment in non-stigmatized settings, that we should try and maximize engagement, that it should be informed by the best evidence-based practice of the time. But certainly in the way it was delivered, it should be optimistic, youth-friendly. As time developed, that became the preferred model of individual and families, and as we developed the evidence, was supported by our National Institute for Clinical Excellence, who actually independently evaluated the data, and in 2009 and further in 2014, supported that actually there was strong evidence for this particular model. When we started out, I think it was informed by best evidence, but it was a bit of a wing and a prayer in terms of would this work, would this model work? But I think we grew in confidence, particularly as the evidence started emerging. We had a rationale too in terms of why we needed to intervene early, not only in terms of the high family, social, familial costs, but also in terms of the impact on social and vocational functioning. But we also looked at evidence in terms of risk of violence and homicide. We looked at evidence in terms of risk of suicide, which was all weighted towards those early years, particularly when someone was untreated. We also looked at employment and educational prospects and showed that actually educational and occupational functioning was already challenged when people were entering services and was quickly falling within the first year of a psychosis. We also looked at the impact of leaving people a long time untreated and the impact that had on long-term outcomes. And then added to that, evidence as it emerged, the sort of very, very clever research of one of my favourite researchers, Mario, showing that when you looked at functional recovery, where someone was at 14 months, predicted what you would see 7.5 years later. And so that was a really strong argument for getting in early, and particularly in the first year, the first 14 months, to try and maximise functioning. If you look in the red column, at Worcester, I established the 6th early intervention service in the UK in 2002. And at that time, the experience for young people and families was that they were taking 12 to 18 months of psychosis before they were actually engaging with services. The majority were hospitalised, half of them under the Mental Health Act. And in terms of things like engagement, we were losing half of them. We didn't know where they were after a year. They were dropping out of services. In terms of family involvement, half families weren't getting any support. In terms of employment, very low education employment prospects. And about half were attempting suicide, with about 10% actually dying by suicide in the first 5 years. And if you just look at the green column, which is based on, I can't even read there, in 2011, that just in a routine early intervention service in the UK, we were able to dramatically reduce the length of time that people were untreated down to 6 weeks, reduce the numbers coming in through a hospital route down to less than 6%, reducing for that group the use of the Mental Health Act, so it's the 6% where it's 14%, so a very small number using the Mental Health Act, engaging families in terms of employment rates, education employment rates up to about 60%, and reducing the suicide attempt rate. And in fact, over 9 years in Worcester, we had no suicides. And so just showing the impact of EI over time in a standard service. One of the things that I would say, has been a useful vehicle in terms of thinking about what we were trying to do, is social movement. It wasn't that we set out to be a social movement. In fact, social movement found us, and we were identified partway through our work as one of the few social movements in health. And interestingly, I'm now on an advisory board trying to support establishing a whole set of social movements supported by big finance and an organisation called Nesta in London. So I sit with them trying to help other people use the principles. And it's very much about where they're collective enterprises seeking to establish a new order of life. They derive their native power on one hand from dissatisfaction and in the current form of life, and on the other from wishes and hopes for a new system of living. And the career of a social movement depicts the emergence of a new order of life. And we were seen as using social movement principles, particularly drawing on narrative, metaphor, to try and help people understand what we were trying to do. So we harness David's dissatisfaction, the dissatisfaction of many other families and young people, but actually set out a stall for a vision of what we wanted to see. One of the things that I was quite clear about was that I'm going to use a framework now, which was a framework I applied in 2014. And it was, again, one of those lucky things that happens. There is an organisation called the International Mental Health Leadership Group, and it's a very, very big meeting. There's one coming up in Washington this September, and it's mental health leaders internationally. And to be invited to be a keynote at that kind of conference is quite something. But you have to make your presentations very broad to appeal to a very wide sector, so it isn't just early intervention and there's learning disabilities. And I was very lucky because it was happening in Old Trafford in Manchester. There was a Canadian who was asked to do a plenary keynote who unfortunately became sick, and an ex-boss of mine when I was a national lead was organising the conference, so they needed someone very quickly, and he said, "Joe, will you do the plenary keynote at IMHL?" He said, "But you mustn't talk about early intervention. It's got to be broader than that." And so I was challenged by this because I didn't have long to think about it. And at the time, early intervention in the UK had been significantly challenged. And I was cross about that, and I was very frustrated, and I didn't understand it because we had, which I'll demonstrate, shown our value. There was strong evidence, and I didn't understand it. So I actually looked at the concept about how we appraise FTSE 100 companies. FTSE 100 are the top performing companies in stocks and shares. They're the companies that people would look to invest in because they produce huge profits and they're seen as everything. And so I took that model and I applied it, and I used early intervention as the example. And the way that we appraise business, and in terms of businesses, are in terms of capital assets. Now, that's not just about its products. So if it was Cadbury's, it's not just about the chocolate, it's about the machinery, it's about the workforce. So I'm going to take you through that, but I'm going to apply it to early intervention, which is what I did in that plenary keynote. So one of the things in terms of appraising a company is in terms of its individual capital. Is there a unique talent, someone or people who have the power to promote or publicise the product and draw attention to the causes? And leadership is quite key. So if we think of things like Apple, Steve Jobs, if you think of Virgin, Richard Branson, there are names that we associate with a particular brand, and they add value to that particular brand. And we had leaders. We had people like David, who was seen as a leader. We also had an international leadership, and you'll see familiar faces there. Pat, you'll also see Angelo Cocci, sadly died, and Anna Mengele from Italy. You've got Paddy Power, who's now in Ireland. In fact, I'm flying out to Ireland next week to train some of the EIP teams out there. You've got Janna Lava-Lansen from Norway, Ashok Malla, who you mentioned, from Canada. You've got Peter Jones, you've got Jean Addington, you've got Merete Nordentoft from Denmark. You've got lots of people there, lots of leaders, and I argued that there was a strong leadership behind this particular early intervention model. The second way in which FTSE 100 are appraised is in terms of their intellectual capital, in terms of individuals taking on key instructional or social roles, becoming involved in causes or controversies, and in terms of trademarks and trade names. And again, we can think about things like Apple. We might think about, say, someone like Virgin in terms of their moves to take people on regular trips to the moon. But let's look at EI. So what we had was IRIS, which is, again, a group of people, a trademark, and we worked with another NGO called Rethink, and Rethink did this great advertising campaign in the UK with something called the Automobile Association, AA, and they were at that time saying that you'd get help within 60 minutes. And we used that in an advertising campaign, talking, but if your mind breaks down, it actually takes 18 months. And we also were, over that time, beginning to influence government. We had national policy supporters us, and we managed to convince them to support a national programme, which we placed, something I'll come to in a minute, the Early Psychosis Declaration at its heart. We created an infrastructure, regional networks, which connected into a national networks, and those still exist. We still have regional networks. And the aim of leaders like myself, who was appointed as the national lead with David, was to navigate obstacles and mobilise others. So it wasn't about doing it for changing things in England. It was about convincing other people to actually take on this particular struggle. One of the things that is less seen, but certainly is important, is in terms of the values of a particular company. And perhaps one might say, one might question that in terms of things like Apple or Facebook or whatever, in terms of their principles. But there are some companies like, for example, Cadbury's or Rowntree's. Cadbury's produced chocolate, but they came from a Quaker background, and very much their ethos was very much values driven in terms of fair rights for workers, housing for workers, schooling for workers, was part of their organisational ethos, and certainly about creating a values-based culture. And that was something that we sought to do in the UK and internationally, and we worked with the IEPA, with the WHO, to create an early psychosis declaration. This is Bernadetta Saracina from the WHO at the time, and we articulated a set of values. So it wasn't just about a model of care, it was about the values that underpin that, what we were trying to achieve for young people and families. But we also have worked with colleagues internationally in terms of identifying other injustices in terms of physical health, so working with people like Phil, Jackie, various colleagues here, in terms of promoting the need to address physical health needs of young people, but also working with people like Owen, Miles Rinaldi in the UK, in terms of addressing educational and employment prospects, and arguing that people with psychosis should have the same life expectancy and expectations of life than peers without psychosis. The fourth element is in terms of social capital, which is about cooperation between individuals, groups and communities. And that's, again, another thing that's used to appraise someone's reach in terms of how they actually work together and collaborate. And certainly EI has benefited from that in terms of being part of an international movement, collaborating internationally on topics of common concern. We also established satellite groups, the International Physical Health Youth Stream, but also the first episode Vocational Recovery Youth Stream, and have met 5 times in different parts of the world on the back of the IEPA conferences. There's instructional capital, which is actually having shareable knowledge, skills and texts, and certainly in EI, what we did was we had a national policy and an implementation guide which articulated a model which had certain criteria in order to be called an early intervention service, and that was articulated in the IRIS guidelines and the repeat of those in 2012. But we also sought to develop thinking, rather than developing thinking on a national scale. What we did was we developed thinking around certain topics within a region with a group of people. And then we developed the hothouse concept. So this is where in hothouses you might grow strawberries in England under glass in April, and then you ship them out to other parts of the country so we can all enjoy strawberries. And that was the model that we used in the UK. So growing thinking around, for example, early detection. We had a meeting in Manchester. We developed early detection guidance, but that was rolled out to across the country. In the same way, in Newcastle, we got together a large group of families and users and carers, and that developed some of our work around family work and some of the principles, but we shipped those out to other regions, and that was the way in which we were able to grow thinking very quickly by doing work with small groups and then actually making that available through those regional networks out to the out nationally. But also a lot of those things that we were producing were also shared internationally. We developed practice in terms of, we developed a practice manual pulling together not only experts in the field and researchers, but also users and carers looking at different aspects, and co-edited a book called Promoting Recovery. But we also sought to work with researchers to grow the evidence base, and that was realised in the NICE guidance, which clearly came down very strongly in favour of early intervention. But we also worked with other groups like the Meriden Project to support the development of tools and resources that were targeted to the early phase, to first episode, rather than just taking products maybe that had been developed for people in later phases. We looked at how it was appropriate to phase, and this is an example of some CDs and materials that were developed with Meriden for working with families in an early psychosis. Financial capital is important, which is about the money invested in a particular company, but also their perception of the expected revenues, and that's certainly a big factor in terms of what makes something a FTSE 100. So what we saw in England, if you look to the right-hand column, is an investment over time of 104 million into the development of early intervention services. That's 208 Australian million dollars at the time. And what we saw, as Pat said, was a growth in early intervention teams, so that by the end of 2010, we had 178 early intervention teams. But it's not just about the investment, and it's also about the products. Does it match up? And what we were able to show, this is a quote from NICE, early intervention, more than any other services developed to date, are associated with improvements in a broad range of critical outcomes, including relapse rates, symptoms, quality of life, better experiences of services. But we also, with the help of colleagues from the London School of Economics, we worked with colleagues Martin Knapp and Paul McCrone, and were able to show huge cost savings, not only in relation just generally to the experience of cost savings from just being in an early intervention service of just under £6,000 per person in the first year, rising up over 3 years to just under 16,000 per person. But we also showed additional cost savings from improving people's employment and educational outcomes, but also savings in terms of the reduction in suicide risk. And we were able to show, with further work involving colleagues like Lucia Valmalgia and Alison Young, and also people like Paul French, Tony Morrison, to also show the impact of working with at-risk mental state, ultra-high risk as you call it, showing savings of around £3,000 per annum. So, by 2014, over a period of 10 years, by 2010, we changed that message of despair from Sue Estroff, which was costing the UK nearly £12 billion per year, which was, this illness usually relapses or becomes chronic. You're going to need medication for the rest of your life. You need to lower your expectations to a clear message of hope with a net saving of around £15 for every pound spent on EIP services, which is you're distressed by your experiences now, but we expect you will get better. Medication can be helpful, but there are other ways that we can help you to help yourself. The aim is that you achieve what you want out of life. Sounds great, right? But in fact, what happened was what we saw was as policy moved, as the light moved, what we saw was, and alongside the economic collapse in 2008, which hit the world, that what we saw was early intervention programs, despite all of that evidence, were under threat. And we saw a dilution of teams, we saw team functions being incorporated into our community mental health team functions, despite the strong, nice evidence there on the right for cost savings. We saw cuts in budgets, staffing, quality in over half of the early intervention services. We saw a decrease in coverage across the country, and indeed the loss of some services like Nottingham that's never been replaced. So, you're wondering what happened with the IMHL, right? Well, my question was, having demonstrated how we would appraise a FTSE 100 company, I argued that actually we had one. We had one in mental health. That if we appraised early intervention against those criteria that we appraised a FTSE 100, we had a FTSE 100 company. People would be wanting to invest in us because the profits were enormous and it was effective. It was something. And what I argued was, well, I don't understand because we've seen this disinvestment. So how are we appraising value in mental health? It's certainly not using the tools and the frameworks we use in business. And it's certainly not based on any kind of logic. And so I talked about that. And what I didn't realise, and this is where luck comes in, Robin, was in the audience waiting to close the conference was a mate, Norman Lamb, who was Minister for Health at the time, who heard me speak. And I was saying, what is to be done? And he came up to me afterwards, and that started a relationship with Norman in terms of thinking about what we could do. He was already an ally, but in fact became an ally because he sat in committees in government that I could never reach. And so we started working with Norman to think, what could we do? And the answer has lain in actually bringing us back to fidelity to model. And Pat talked about the importance of that in terms of looking at the adherence of early intervention services. What we had was a weakening of early intervention. So people were calling things an early intervention service, but were actually disabling it from being able to deliver the model. So what we suggested was looking at establishing some clear criteria in terms of the model, the workforce, the skill mix, evidence-based interventions, and we looked at how we could develop national standards based on the NICE quality standards for psychosis treatment and build in a process whereby early intervention services in the UK were audited at baseline, which was done in the period 2015-16, and then repeat annual audits. So we were actually calling services and providers to account against criteria in terms of adherence to model. And so this is what happened in 2014 to 2020, that in fact in the October of that year came out a document, a government document. It wasn't specific to EI. It was very much about achieving better access. But at the centre of that was a new access and wait time target, which was around early intervention. And it was actually arguing, and the target was that more than half of the people experiencing a first episode of psychosis will be treated with a NICE approved care package within 2 weeks of referral. Very bold aspirations. And the access and wait time target actually came in 2016. It required that there was 2 weeks from referral and that people were treated in accordance with the NICE quality standards for psychosis. So for someone with the first episode of psychosis, the clock started and stopped. The clock stopped when they were accepted onto caseload and an early intervention coordinator had been allocated and a NICE care package had been commenced. And for at-risk mental state, what you call ultra-high risk, when the person was accepted onto caseload and a care coordinator allocated and a specialist at-risk mental state, the COMS had been commenced by a clinician. So the NICE standards, these are there, you can look them up, it's the QS80. These were used as the standards that services were to aspire to, but we also, for the first time, introduced national outcome measures, asking early intervention services. They were already completing the HONOS, which was already part of a national outcome package, but we added in dialogue and QPR, and I'll come back to those later in a few minutes, in terms of outcome measurement, and they should be recorded at least twice, so we had baseline and follow-up, typically at 12 months, and repeated annually. So there were 3 immediate challenges in this new guidance for early intervention teams in the UK. One of the things that was slipped into it, and certainly which we battled very hard, people like me battled very hard but didn't win, partly because NICE had said, the evidence base, NICE in their 2014 guidance had said it should be offered to people of all ages, so I was arguing against NICE. But we also were arguing against structures that were very much about equity of access. And NHS England and Department of Health were very much about arguing that we should be going that we shouldn't have age-specific services. Pat, we argued it till we were blue in the face. And so we were asked to open up to 65. Now, that wasn't necessarily without evidence, because there was evidence that there were a group of people, and certainly we experienced that in services, who were developing a first episode psychosis beyond 35. Typically women, often affective psychosis, predominantly women, affective psychosis, and there was a group. We just didn't know, and the issue was, what did this mean for early intervention caseloads? Would this dilute the youth focus? It would create new service boundaries at 65 and the gaming that might go on there. And we just didn't know what the needs of this group would be. We had at-risk mental state, because again, there was a requirement that early intervention services address the needs of people with at-risk mental state, and typically that had only been done by research services, research-based services up to that point. So asking clinical services to take that on, and there was a concern, were early intervention services going to get flooded with referrals? How much time should be allocated? And also whether it should be age-restricted, because clearly were we going to do at-risk mental state up to 65 was the question, because of the age criteria. And then there were issues around compliance with the NICE QS80, which is it required increases in CBT, family intervention, employment support. Were there sufficient specialists with the appropriate competencies to deliver those interventions? So what we had was the audit covered several domains, 3 domains. So there was obviously the NICE package, CBT, employment education, family interventions, physical health assessment, physical health intervention and carer support. There was a domain which was about the structure of the service in terms of how that service operated, whether it was a standalone, whether it was doing outcome measures, its provision for under 18-year-olds, caseload sizes, waiting time. And then, so these were classed into 3 domains: timely access, that was the 2-week wait, effective treatment, and a well-managed service, and would give an overall score for services for each individual service. If you look down the left-hand column, how were these assessed in the audit? Well, there's something called the mental health minimum dataset, where the data in terms of wait time is entered electronically, so we're able to draw on that to find out how quickly people are seen. But what we asked was each early intervention team was asked to identify 100 patients from their caseload. And there was a service user level questionnaire, but there were also fidelity checks. So I'm a national lead. So this year, early intervention teams were asked to identify 100 patients. Now imagine in Birmingham with 7 teams, we're talking about 700 patients that we're auditing across several teams. Similarly in Manchester with 5 teams, 500 patients. But what we did was we chose certain services we would go in and fidelity check their responses. So it's self-report. So we went into 4 services this year between February to actually check the reports that were coming in to validate that there was good match between what people were saying. We also have a service contextual questionnaire filled in. It's a self-report from the team. But we also asked people to complete these outcome measures, the dialogue QPR and the HONESCA, sorry. And I'll come back to those in a second. But what you get in the audit data is you get a sense of where each team is performing in terms of their service configuration, in terms of their ability to deliver treatment, in terms of timely access, and you get an overall rating for teams. So we get a sense, an individual team will get a sense of where they are, but we also get a sense of where the whole of the UK is. In terms of policy guidance, there's been an investment over time. It's a cumulative investment up to 70 extra million coming in over time. And what we were seeking was that over time that we would move towards, by 2020, only 60% of people being seen within 2 weeks, and that 60% of services would be graded as performing well by 2020. Now that was supported by a workforce planning model, so there is actually a tool that teams could use to work out what kind of workforce do they need, and that was based on James Kirkbride's work on incidents of psychosis from Synaptic. And this is what it showed. I've got just a few more slides. So in terms of baseline fidelity, this was done in 2015. What it showed was that the majority of teams, in fact 80%, were standalone specialist teams. Majority working with people 14 to 35. A small number, 15%, 16% were working with people up to 65. Most working with people for up to 3 years, although there was quite a range there. The average caseload, we were saying in the model it should be 1 to 15, came out as an average of 16.8. And 1/3 of patients were being seen within 2 weeks, so quite a big challenge to get to 50%. And there was huge variability in the delivery of psychological and medical interventions. In subsequent audits, what we saw, so this was audits in 2016-17, 2017-18, was that we managed, in fact, within a short space of time, that 85% of people in the UK starting a first episode psychosis are seen within 2 weeks of referral. What we saw were improvements in terms of people taking up. We didn't measure offer because there could be gaming. You could say we offered everybody, which is gaming always occurs in an audit. And people say, well, we offered 100%. So actually the criteria was, it was whether people received it and took it up. And we did include in that, we did allow for refusals, but we recorded those. So what we saw were improvements in CBT, carer education support, family intervention, more getting a full physical health screen and relevant interventions. But there were still workforce and training gaps to deliver CBT, family intervention and IPS. 80% of services were achieving level 2 needing improvement, and just a smaller number were achieving level 3 performing well or top performing level 4. And there was huge variability in the both structure, workforce and delivery of service, and there were very few services that were concordant. So please don't take any photos of this slide, because this is where I'm breaking news and it's embargoed data. No one in the UK knows this data yet because it's embargoed till the end of June. But I thought I'd give you a snapshot of where things are at this year, which is slight drop in access and weight, 76% being seen within 2 weeks, but 64% actually offered all 7 physical health screenings. 54% with at least 2 trials with clozapine. So 54% offered clozapine after unsuccessful trials with 2 other antipsychotics. 22% of people had outcome measurements, a set of paired outcome measurements, and 46% receiving CBTP. These are averages. Obviously, the ranges are huge, and in fact, there are some where it's very high. 22% take it family intervention, 28% receiving employment support. And I think we have to bear in mind with those lower figures is that the evidence base for the take-up of some of these interventions is low. So this is actually quite remarkable in terms of some of this take-up. Because compared to the actual evidence of take-up of these things. So, what are the current challenges? There are challenges in relation to at-risk mental state. They're still in their infancy in most teams. Opening up acceptance criteria has led to a massive increase in referral and assessments required, and as much as 34% extra referrals. That's created challenges for workforce capacity and indeed workforce planning, which hadn't really taken into account those referral rates. It has implications for training in terms of at-risk mental state pathways and understanding what the needs are of people over 35. We've had challenges in relation to the age range. Again, that's led to substantial increases in rates of referral and assessments. The numbers assessed who've met criteria, these are published data, somewhere around sort of a quarter to a third extra referrals, and we still need a much better understanding of what the needs of this group are and how that's going to impact on outcomes. So research is going on looking at those services that have gone up to 65 to see what are the needs and how are we responding to that and what impact is that having. We've had challenges in terms of delivering CBTP, family intervention, carer, education and support, and IPS. It's very variable. There are skills gaps and there's been training gaps and there's still variability. And often the ability to deliver those relies on having the resources to do that. There's been challenges in terms of physical health monitoring and intervention. Certainly, what we've seen is an increase in screening, but what we have seen, and I think one thing that for me was particularly worried, David and Helen Lester used the term, don't just screen, intervene. And in this year's audit, there were people identified as having dyslipidemia or diabetes or high risk of diabetes in the audit. So the audit data, the screening data, was showing that these individuals were either red in terms of having diabetes or having dyslipidemia, and yet there was no evidence of referral for intervention, which is a safety risk issue, and indeed in this year's report is one of the biggest things that went immediately back to those provider trusts saying, don't just screen, you need to intervene, and when people are identified as being at risk. And that's an understanding that it isn't just jumping through hoops to make sure that you screen people. There's a meaning behind this because we're trying to pick up people who are at risk physically. So final one, in terms of outcome measurement, I said that the outcome measurement is based on 2 or more outcome measures recorded at least twice. We're using HONOS, which was already there, but we added in Dialogue a patient-related outcome measure which monitors satisfaction with life domains and also treatment satisfaction. And we added in the QPR. These both got good psychometric properties, looking at the process of recovery, and these are scored by service users, not by services. We're trying to move towards bringing that in, and you can imagine introducing that on a national scale, that to get 22% has been incredible. And next year, what we're moving to is we'll actually start using that data to audit outcomes and pair those process measures with outcomes. Does it actually influence outcomes? So we'll have national data on outcomes emerging using those scales. So final comments. Internationally, I think we're leading in terms of national fidelity audit, and we've been auditing annually now for 4 years. We've seen year-on-year improvements in terms of access and weight and quality of care delivered. We've seen increases in the proportion of people receiving family intervention, CBT, specialist employment and educational support, and clozapine. We're still struggling. in relation to opening up to over 35s and at-risk mental state. Teams still have insufficient access to specialist expertise to deliver some of these interventions. We've got 22% of people audited. We're talking, in this audit, we're talking about audit of over 9,000 young people with psychosis. So it's a big, so 22%, we're talking about data on about 2,500 people that we'll have outcome data for. But the challenge is still there to commission high quality services that are adequately funded to deliver against these standards. Thank you.